we are joined by Wade Goria, who is a docent at the National Lighthouse Museum. So I'm just going to invite him here to turn on his video. Just bear with us for a moment, folks. Hey, Wade, can you hear us okay?
That's fine, Andrew. Yeah. The name, by the way, was spelled Gloria. It's Goria, G-O-R-I-A.
Oh, sorry. That was autocorrect.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm the lecturer and an historian at the Lighthouse Museum.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. We got your video now.
There we are. Okay.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about your role and how long you've been involved with the National Lighthouse Museum.
All right. Let's see. Well, I think the first time that I saw the National Lighthouse Museum was when I used to take walks with my father over to Staten Island from the 69th Street Pier, which had a ferry boat. There were 7 ferry boats that ran over to St. George for a nickel. And it was a big part of my childhood. In fact, there was, it's still there, the Joseph Lyons Pool. I used to go there as a child. And Staten Island back then was the country, but my father loved being around Staten Island because it was so rural. And I remember first seeing the Coast Guard base that occupied that space at the age of 5. I had no knowledge whatsoever that it was it had been the general depot of the U.S. Lighthouse Board. So that's the first time I ever confronted it. And back in 2015, I retired. I was, for 18 years, I taught international relations at New York University. And I've always been a lover of maritime history. And I heard about the opening of the Lighthouse Museum. I went over there early in 2016, had a fantastic tour, and decided that I love these people and that this was a place I'd really like to help out in my retirement. So I started helping out, giving tours. Before I knew it, I was giving all of the boat tours for the Lighthouse Museum. And I've been doing that, well, this is my 5th year, or 4th year, coming up on my 5th year. And so I do all the boat tours, and that includes tours up the Hudson River to Tarrytown, to Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, along the Ambrose Channel, a circumnavigation of Staten Island, and a tour up the East River all the way to Sands Point in Long Island. And I've also done some writing and lecturing for the National Lighthouse Museum. I did some lectures on Alexander Hamilton. And this summer, I did a 3-hour virtual lecture on the Union blockade during the American Civil War.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So they've kept me very busy.
Yeah.
And the people at the National Lighthouse Museum I consider to be wonderful, absolutely wonderful folks. There's some great volunteers, marvelous, selfless people who really are a credit, I think, to the society that we live in. And so I've been very, very happy contributing in my own way to the success of the National Lighthouse Museum.
And it's such a great institution to have now on Staten Island as well.
Well, it certainly is. It's I am quite sentimental about remembering. I remember my father, vividly remember my father telling me. Now, my father was in the Army, and he got a Bronze Star at the Battle of the Bulge. And he said, son, I really don't want you to be in the Army and go through what I went through. But if you have to go into the service, make it the Coast Guard. And I remember seeing all the Coast Guard ships around there and sort of being inspired by the Coast Guard. But I didn't make the Coast Guard my career. but still have a great deal of sentimentality in that way.
Yeah, and you mentioned not to date you, but you mentioned the 69th Street Ferry. So this is the days before the Verrazano Bridge.
Yes.
But you're joining us from Bay Ridge right now as we speak.
Yes, I should say that I live in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and Bay Ridge is just across the Narrows, and I live on 85th Street in Brooklyn. It's about about a mile walk down to the 69th Street Pier. But when I was a young boy, I lived on 67th Street in Ridge Boulevard. So it was a very quick walk. And I used to sell lemonade and newspapers to the people who lined up for many, many blocks to get onto that ferry, because that was the principal way that people got to Staten Island. And so that ferry closed down when the Verrazano Bridge opened in 1965. And I was a very heartbroken young man at that time.
Yeah.
It was a great resource for the people of Bay Ridge and for Staten Island. And I can't tell you how pleasant those boat rides were.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I should say that I'm also live in Brooklyn, but I'm not joining folks from Brooklyn, but I am in the state. We put this out on Twitter. I am in the state that has more lighthouses than any other, which is Michigan.
Yes,
the lighthouse
100, I believe, right?
Yeah, yeah. But without further ado, let's dive right in. So we have some images that we're going to look at, and Wade, you're going to walk us through a little bit of the history of the institution, but also of the lighthouse service itself.
Right, right.
Okay, so just let me know when you can see this.
Okay.
All right, you see that map?
There's a nice, very nice overview showing, and I think one of the things to keep in mind about the location of the General Depot, formerly the Maritime Hospital, is its proximity to Brooklyn. And well, before let's start out the land that occupies the present museum. In 1799, a marine hospital was established. This was a quarantine hospital. And the reason why it was placed on the area that today is known as St. George and Tompkinsville is due largely to the fact that it was isolated. It was quite a remote area. I've read a number of accounts that without good weather conditions, it could take as much as 5 hours to sail from Manhattan to Staten Island, which meant that Staten Island was a safe place to put a quarantine station. But with the advent of steam navigation for ferry boats in 1814, Manhattan and Staten Island became very well connected. And so the population began to grow in the area of St. George, Tompkinsville. And so what had been a very isolated marine hospital or quarantine now became rather populated. As population grew certainly in New York City and in the area of St. George, particularly in the 1830s and 1840s, when vast numbers of Irish and German immigrants entered, the area began, and the whole city began to experience cholera outbreaks, malaria outbreaks, and there were problems in St. George. And the people who lived in St. George were petitioning to Albany to find a new location for the quarantine. And I often like to say when I'm giving a tour that Albany did back then what it does now, absolutely nothing. And so the people became increasingly frustrated. And on September the 1st, 1858, a number of private landowners torched the facility over a 2-day period, completely destroying it. And so the whole area, approximately 18 acres, was ashes. Now, the land had been partly owned by the federal government. In fact, in an arrangement that was accomplished by Governor Daniel Tompkins, who also served as vice president under James Monroe, 5 acres was acquired by the federal government and used for the Revenue Cutter Service and for some of the people who were employed by the Revenue Cutter Service. So even during the time that it served as a quarantine, it was not alien to the use of the what was the Lighthouse establishment, later to become the Lighthouse Board. And so for that reason, in a sense, the area was already on the radar of the people who wanted to establish a super depot, part of one of the 13 depots that was part of the 3rd district of the U.S. Lighthouse Board, and which extended from Maine down to the Delaware Bay. And so a super depot was built beginning in 1864. Now, what you see in this slide are examples of buoys, that nun buoys, which mark channels. Nun buoys can be in red or green colors, and they're placed where a channel splits into 2. Green on the top means that keep the buoy on your left. A red metal buoy made of 2 cones joined at the base marks the starboard side of the channel as you approach it from the sea. So one of the big activities of the General Depot, as it was called, was the construction of buoys. It also had lighthouse tenders, and of course, its main job was to repair lighthouses, and it was the only facility in the United States where lenses came from France, Fresnel lenses, that became such an important part of the lighthouse technology. So what you're looking at in this picture are examples of buoys and the coastal area that the depot occupied.
So the depot was a huge area, but if we go back to this picture right here, tell us a little bit about what part of the depot we're seeing here.
This building actually, which is the headquarters of the National Lighthouse Museum, is the machine shop, building number 11, and it actually was only built in 1912 and done in a neo-Dutch revival style, which was very popular at the time. And if you go up to Hamilton Heights in Harlem, you'll see a lot of buildings like that. And so that was a place where a lot of metalworking, certainly building of buoys, repair of metal took place. It has a very high ceiling. So, you know, some of these buoys are very, very tall and need height. And so this became a facility that had been, other buildings had occupied. This became a dedicated site for the building of buoys and for metal repair. Now, just to our right of the building is the lamp shop that was built in 1864. Again, a dedicated lamp shop where Fresnel lenses were stored. So this was, in some ways, from the point of view of lighthouse technology, this was mission control for the arrival of lights. Of course, after an Atlantic voyage, there could be damage done. And so there were engineers who would make sure that the optics were in complete alignment. And once everything was checked out, it would be ready to ship, quite possibly, Andrew, over to Michigan. And but again, as I emphasized, this was the only facility where Fresnel lights were arrived.
Wow. And then we have a picture here, which is from the latter days of the depot, but gives people a sense of the larger complex.
Andrew, I can't tell you how happy I was to see that picture, because that is precisely the way the depot area looked when it was dominated by the Coast Guard, and I was a boy of 11 years old, walking with my father on a Sunday morning and looking at the Coast Guard ships. And quite longingly, I thought they were beautiful ships. The Coast Guard took over the operation of what became known as the Lighthouse Service in 1903. And well, the Coast Guard took it over in 1939. And so let me just, if you hear different names, I want to clarify for people. Mm-hmm. The original name was the Lighthouse Establishment, as it was first set forth in an congressional infrastructural bill of 1789. And that is August of 1789. And that's the date that we celebrate each year in our gala. Now, it continued to be called the Establishment until 1851, March 3rd, 1851 to be exact, when it became known as the U.S. Lighthouse Board. And it became much more professional. Scientists, members of the Army Corps of Engineers and naval engineers, admirals became part of the Lighthouse Board. And there had been a great movement towards trying to professionalize the Lighthouse establishment, because they were really lagging seriously behind Britain and France in lighthouse technology. And the establishment of the Lighthouse Board helped to helped America catch up with the British. Mm-hmm. And then in 1903, it became the U.S. Lighthouse Service. It had originally been established under the Department of Treasury. It moved over to the Department of Commerce and Labor. And it continued to be named Lighthouse Service until 1939, when the Coast Guard took it over. And today, Coast Guard, as I'm sure many know, is under the control of Homeland Security. So ultimately now, Homeland Security controls what was the Lighthouse Service.
Right. We've talked about this on several programs, the sort of, Frankenstein's monster that is the U.S. Coast Guard, bringing together the Lighthouse Board and the U.S. Life Saving Service and the Revenue Cutter Service, all sort of assembled together into the agency that we have today.
That's right. Exactly. The agency that we have today, excuse me, just one second.
No worries.
Someone is knocking at my door, and I want to make sure that. Hi. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Ron. Okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. So, yeah, originally, yeah, it's complicated, but I can explain. The Lighthouse Establishment needed an enforcer, which became known as the Revenue Marine, later to be called the Revenue Cutter Service. And then in 1915, the Revenue Cutter Service merged with the Life Saving Service to form the U.S. Coast Guard. And as I said before, eventually that comes under Homeland Security.
Right.
So,
right.
But by the way, there were a lot of people not terribly happy that a highly professional organization such as the Lighthouse Service came under the Coast Guard, because they saw themselves as very specialized, and they thought a lot of the people who worked for the Coast Guard, while certainly good people, had none of the knowledge and expertise that they possessed. So there were some difficulties between employees as they tried to blend Coast Guard or allow the Coast Guard to adopt the Lighthouse Service.
And of course, the members of the Lighthouse Service were all civilian employees, and they're
exactly
being brought into a uniformed service.
Exactly, Andrew. They were civilian employees, highly skilled, and not terribly happy that now they weren't being given the same sort of, in a sense, the same sort of respect and attention that they had been given as an individual
Right.
organization. And now the slide that we're looking at
Mm-hmm.
was the inspector's building. Absolutely everything seemed to happen in that building. It at one stage, it housed experiments, Fresnel lenses. I mean, just about everything that you could imagine was going on in there. And it became very clear with all the experiments taking place, it was a rather dangerous facility.
Mm.
And a lot of records were stored there, and it was thought that this was not a good idea to have all of the important records kept in this building, which is why the administration building that was constructed, which we'll talk about in a moment, built in 1871, was built. And then because the Fresnel lights were arriving with such rapidity, there needed to be a separate building altogether for the what would be called the lamp shop. So the lamp shop, that building that was to the right of building number 11, was built. And this facility continued to have operations, but it wasn't the everything building that it had been.
And is this a contemporary photo?
Yes,
yeah.
I took this myself not more than a week ago.
And people might be curious what the kind of status of this building is today.
Well, Andrew, we had some real hope that this building was actually going to be an entryway to a twin Westin hotel that was supposed to be built to the left of it. Mm. And unfortunately, well, it's quite a long, talk about complications. You may know that there had been grand plans for a giant wheel
right.
that was supposed to be a little bit higher than the London Eye and a little bit shorter than the Dubai Eye, which was going to put Staten Island on the map as a major tourist center. With all the people coming to visit that eye, there were great plans to have hotels. That building behind it is actually a condominium that has continued to be built. They've resumed work on it, and I don't know when it's going to finish because it's been a while. Ever since I started volunteering in early 2016, the foundation was there in 2016, so it's been a slow process.
Right.
But I believe that building will be finished. What happens to the left with the twin Westin towers is anyone's guess. There have been some other development in the area that has not been altogether successful.
Right.
And so these buildings this particular building is not landmarked. And in fact, most of the buildings of the old General Depot are not landmarked, with the exception of the administration building, which we'll talk about.
And it's also important to know this is also not under the remit of the National Lighthouse Museum.
That's right.
Right.
There had been a time when organizers of the National Lighthouse Museum kind of envisaged a facility that would be, I suppose, like Colonial Williamsburg, where they'd show all the operations and they'd have people who might talk about the metalworking and all the different sorts of repairs. It was a very, very grand and ambitious idea, but money, of course, got in the way. And so the plans had to be shrunk a bit. And that's where building number 11 right now is the only building that's been restored. And what we're looking at here are that there were 6 vats that originally contained whale oil and later kerosene and then oil to be used for the lamps. And of course, this was before the electrification of lighthouses. And, you know, for the something that you could tell that people could share with each other, the first lighthouse to be electrified in the United States was the Statue of Liberty. A lot of people don't realize that Statue of Liberty was a lighthouse as well as a symbol of French-American friendship and liberty. And but it ceased to function as a lighthouse in 1901. But before, of course, the gradual electrification of lighthouses, there needed to be a safe place where this fuel could be stored. And so these gigantic vats with absolutely beautiful brickwork were constructed and served in that capacity. Very, very important to the entire facility. And now here we have the Alfred B Mullet building. And I'd like to share a little bit about Alfred Mullet because I think he's very interesting. Alfred Mullet was I believe he was a truly great architect. And certainly the fact that this administration building is the only building that's been designated as a landmark. It can't be torn down for any reason and must be restored. Alfred Mullet was responsible for the building of the executive office building. That building that looks quite out of place in Washington, D.C., because it's a French Second Empire style, much like this one. And now Mullet did build designed other buildings that weren't just French Second Empire buildings, but he absolutely adored the architecture of Georges Eugène Haussmann, who was the architect of Paris under Napoleon III. And during a trip to Paris, he was just overwhelmed by the beauty of this type of architecture. And he became the designing architect, head architect of the Department of Treasury. Remember that Treasury was still in charge of the Lighthouse Board. And so he constructed this building, and it's beautiful. It has red sandstone, beautiful brickwork, Flemish ornamentation at the bottom, very, very beautiful mansard roof style. And inside there were beautiful murals. And so this became the administration building. This was central control. This was the headquarters. It contained all the archives. And today it's in a very sad state, but I'm happy to say, as you can see, it's covered here in a kind of white tarpaulin. They haven't made much progress in the years that I've been there in restoring this building, but it will be restored. It's going to happen as long as, I suppose, there's some sort of funding for it. But it is a great building. I'll just say one other thing, that all those federal buildings that have been attacked by some of the people in Portland. One of the buildings, which was the big federal building in Portland, was the work of Alfred Mullet.
Oh,
and yeah, and he also, and I want to tell you a nice little bit of trivia. He also built the Grand Post Office, the main post office, which used to reside right near City Hall, just north of City Hall. It was a building that I'm afraid it shared a lot in common with the executive office building in Washington, in that a lot of people hated it. They sort of didn't get that architecture. They thought it was out of place. It was eventually torn down in 1939, and the eagles from that building were moved over to Grant's Tomb. So the next time anyone visits Grant's Tomb, the eagles used to reside on the building that was constructed by Alfred B Mullet, the Grand Post Office. And there's another post office that's still standing in St. Louis. That was his work. So he was a great architect. However, he received so much criticism, was involved in so many lawsuits, and eventually ended up taking his life from all of the heartbreak and frustration of not being appreciated. Eventually, the executive office building was greatly appreciated in the 1990s. They made great strides in restoring that building. And I think right now its place in Washington's history is very solid. We hope that this building will also follow suit and become one of the gems that it's intended to be. For New York City, I should say. Okay, now this placard, which is in the museum, shows Augustin Fresnel. Augustin Fresnel, during the era of Napoleon Bonaparte, was a road builder. Of course, Napoleon depended a great deal on roads to move his armies. And Fresnel had established a very solid reputation as an extremely competent road builder. But he didn't really like building roads so much. He really wanted to experiment with light. And because there had been a big problem in the 19th century, early 19th century, even though there were lighthouses being constructed and the United States began a very active lighthouse program, people complained they couldn't see the light. Navy captains were constantly bemoaning the fact that the lights were not bright enough. So Fresnel went to work, and without going into too much of the science here, his ideas rested on a particle theory of light, which was, the particle theory of light had very much been a part of Newton. But Augustin Fresnel believed in the wave theory of light. And by juxtaposing these panels, these optical panels, in an amazingly complex way, he could produce powerful lights. There was a great, I wish somebody would make a movie about this because I think it's very exciting. There was a contest in Montmartre, which is the big hill where Sacré-Cœur is located in Paris. And there were other challengers to Fresnel. However, Fresnel blew them away. And when people saw the light emanating from his lens, they could not believe it. And he became, shall we say, a legend in his own time. Now, these lights revolutionized lighthouse technology, and they were rapidly adopted by the United States, certainly by the French. However, as I mentioned before, U.S. technology lagged because I think the U.S. lighthouse establishment was not being run by the most, let's say, scientific people. And so it took some time for the U.S. to catch up. Not until the Lighthouse Board was created in 1851 did they finally start importing large numbers of Fresnel lights into the United States.
And was there a period when did the U.S. become able to manufacture these themselves, or were they dependent upon the French for a very long time?
They really depended on the French and the British. This was something that no one did better. I mean, there were a number of very important companies located mainly in Brittany, in Western France, and then the British were making extremely important lights, and the United States tended to rely on British and French technology for this. It's by the way, okay, now this is a photograph showing the lamp shop workers in, I believe that date is 1898, is that?
1890. Mm-hmm.
1890, all right. And just something about these workers. By all accounts, and you know, there's a lot of archival material at the National Lighthouse Museum, and these workers tended to be from English, Irish, Scot, German background in the 19th century, increasingly as large numbers of very skilled Italians immigrated to the United States after 1900. Many more in the 1890s and 1900, many more were Italian. And by all accounts, they were paid a decent wage. They were secure jobs. There were about 250 workers altogether at the depot, and the lamp shop workers were highly skilled. These are the ones that made sure that these Fresnel lights were in proper condition and ready to be shipped to wherever they would be installed. All right, we have a collection of some of the, again, the nun buoys. You can't see the colors, but they'd either be red or green. I do have a photo that shows the colors of the nun buoys, but storing these nun buoys and getting them ready for shipment. A lot of these nun buoys would have been constructed in the building that's immediately to the left, and that would be building number 11, the machine shop. And again, as I mentioned before, these are channel markers, and they're very, very important for allowing a ship to determine in which direction it will go. Red and green colors or lights could be placed in those colors where a channel splits in two, green on the top and keep it, green on the top meant keep the buoy to the left, and a red metal buoy made of two cones joined at the base, making if it's red, stay to the starboard side. Mm-hmm. And so very important. You know, people of course think of the depot as mainly concerned with the repair of lighthouses and the building of lighthouses, but in fact the buoys were a very important part of the entire infrastructure for the general depot.
And we had a question here, which is how were these buoys moved about? And then would these buoys be going all over the United States, you know, to California, Alaska, out of this depot in Staten Island?
Yes, these buoys, there were other depots that were manufacturing buoys, but this, shall we say, was the most prolific of the manufacturers of buoys. And they could be, I mean, if there was a shortage anywhere, they could be moved anywhere in the United States. Mm-hmm. And they were, I mean, they had facilities here that were really unrivaled. You know, having a specialized building for mostly the construction of buoys was a great asset for the general depot.
Mm-hmm. And would they lift these up with a derrick or a crane of some kind to move them onto a ship?
Yes, and keep in mind, you know, people sometimes think that they're a lot heavier than they are. Uh-huh. Of course, they wouldn't be buoys if they you know were solid metal, right? And so they're steel sheathed, and sometimes they even put oil, which is lighter than water, inside of these buoys. But they could be moved. They could be moved by cranes, or they could be moved even by a number of people. Mm-hmm. To wherever they needed to go.
Thank you for that question. That was from Liesel.
Yeah, it was a great question. Mm-hmm. All right, now we're looking, there was a testing lighthouse on the grounds of the depot, and the testing lighthouse, of course, after a light came from across the Atlantic Ocean, the need to test it, to shoot a beam across to Brooklyn, probably aiming right at Bay Ridge where I live now, was a common practice. They wanted to make sure that everything was in alignment, everything was in order. And so this lighthouse stood in the courtyard of the General Depot until 1898. In 1898, and it's a long story about this, there's a place called Shoals. That's Romer, by the way, was the man who was a cartographer who, during the English colonial period, had mapped a shoals area that's just off the coast of Sandy Hook. They had all kinds of problems with, they had various beacons in that location, and they constantly had damage. It constantly wasn't working. So finally, the depot decided, we don't need this testing lighthouse here anymore, because most of the lights that we're trying to fit in that facility aren't even fitting in that facility. And there was a kind of a desperate call for a new light. Now, this would have been a caisson type. This is a spark plug type lighthouse, probably built in the Westervelt facility up in Troy, New York. They were sort of cookie cutter type cast iron spark plug design. And they would be put in with caissons, very, very strong. And that's what they did to Romer Shoals. So it was moved to Romer Shoals in 1898. And the only thing that remains there now is just a bunch of rocks, sort of implying that that was the sort of simulating the shoals of Romer Shoals. I should mention to you that during Tropical Storm Sandy, we nearly lost Romer Shoals, and it's on the top 5 list of most endangered lighthouses. We're going to see another lighthouse further on. This one is perfect. This is the Old Orchard Shoals Lighthouse, very similar to the Romer Shoals Lighthouse, off the coast, the south coast of Staten Island, the Great Kills area. It was a very popular site for people who had boats in Great Kills Harbor. And when Tropical Storm Sandy hit at the end of October in 2012, this Orchard Shoals lighthouse was destroyed. Now, what happened, this one just completely obliterated, a kind of a washing machine effect. The water got in, and if you've ever put a washing machine on a super cycle, and sometimes the washing machine gets a little crazy because the water is going back so ferociously, the doors of this lighthouse broke through. We had a 30-foot tidal wave hitting it, and once that water got inside, the entire lighthouse broke. Now this is a watercolor done by a very prominent Staten Island artist by the name of Bill Murphy, who's a member of the faculty of Wagner College in Staten Island. And but very sadly, when we do our boat tours, particularly the circumnavigation tour of Staten Island, all we see are the rocks that remain around that area.
I just wanted to mention a comment we just got here from Mary, going back to our discussion about Fresnel lenses. She said that her husband spent several years working in theatrical and film lighting, and that many of the lenses they use are based on Fresnel's work in these industries.
What Fresnel did for technology is really, that's a wonderful comment. And Fresnel, I mean, there's it's a fascinating story about Fresnel and what it did for instance, navigation around the world. It opened up new sea lanes. It created sea lanes that had been previously sort of off limits because there weren't adequate lights. Mm-hmm. And so it really kind of connected in a very global way with a global infrastructure. It helped to connect the world. And the impact on lighting in movies and everything else, very important. So Fresnel really is a marvelous inventor who had a gigantic impact mm-hmm. on the world.
So we just have a couple of minutes left, Wade,
mm-hmm.
but we do have a few more photos that we want to get through.
Sure. Right. Now, this is the spot where the Romer Shoals, now Romer Shoals Lighthouse, used to sit. Mm. And so you see, by the way, those red buoys, they're called anchor buoys. And the anchor buoys are very important when the ships enter the harbor. They will take those anchor buoys and put them on the ship using with a cleg, sort of a clamp that puts them onto the ship. And anyway, that was where the lighthouse, testing lighthouse, stood. And we have some objects. One of the things that I think is terribly interesting about the General Depot is that absolutely everything except the Fresnel lights was manufactured from the raw materials, from scratch at the depot. So that everything from that bronze dustpan to the brush, to the toilet paper roll, to the clock, silver sugar services, you name it. Everything was made by these incredibly skilled artisans who, you know, I often like to say, think of the sort of person you'd like to come to your house and fix everything. These guys were those sorts of people. They could do anything. And so this is a display case of some of the items that was that were kept by Carlo Perazzi, whose picture we're going to see. That's Carlo Perazzi. His a descendant of Carlo Perazzi is a member of the museum today, and I've spoken with him on the phone. Never actually met him in person, but Carlo Perazzi was a very, very skilled worker from Italy, had a great reputation, and one of those people that could absolutely fix anything. Very patient, very fine person, and very loyal to the Lighthouse service. And these are, again, more items, everything from the tools to you see some of those right at the top. We'll get a close-up in the next slide, Andrew. Yeah, there's a nice close-up of a lamp that was given to Carlo Perazzi after 25 years of service to the General Depot, and it's a beautiful bronze lighthouse lamp that the family of Carlo Perazzi donated to our collection.
Oh, that's great.
And this boat here, it has. I could talk about this endlessly, but I'll try to make it brief here. This was a standard issue lighthouse rowboat, and keeping in mind, as you pointed out before, about the various tasks of the lighthouse keepers. The lighthouse keepers were expected to keep the lights going, but they were also expected to save people. So that, for instance, Kate Walker of Robbins Reef is known to have saved over 50 people and a dog during her career in a boat just like this. This boat was buried under sand and discovered, and eventually the Coast Guard found it, I believe. I've heard a couple of accounts. I've heard that it was found on the North Shore of Long Island near Glen Cove, and I've also heard that it was found at near the Elm Tree Lighthouse on the coast of Staten Island, southern coast. And but in any event, the Coast Guard got in touch with the National Lighthouse Museum, and it was given to the museum, and it's one of the first things you see as you enter the museum. That's great. And this is our hall of lights. This is of course, so one of the things that people will ask when they first come to the Lighthouse Museum, where's a lighthouse? But, not fully comprehending the fact that this facility was in charge of repairing lighthouses and installing buoys and saving lighthouses. One thing I didn't mention, the tenders sometimes would come and save a lighthouse keeper who may be frozen in during a severe winter and provide food and rescue supplies. But in any event, this is not a lighthouse. It's built of wood, but it houses about 300 lighthouses. Many of them were, these lighthouses are replicas of some of the famous lighthouses in the world. There are 10,000 lighthouses in the world. Michigan, by the way, Andrew, is very well represented. And but we have the Pharos Lighthouse, and we have Hookhead, and you name it. Even lighthouse ships are displayed here. And you can sponsor a lighthouse with a gift to the National Lighthouse Museum. So if there's a particular lighthouse that's very sentimental to you, you can provide a gift to the Lighthouse Museum, and they'll display it.
Oh, that's great.
And again, here we see one of the nun buoys, and now you can see the green and the red. And I mentioned to the importance of that. That's the ship where I give the tours. That's my home. In normal times, we didn't have a normal year. We will have 3 tours this year that are on our schedule. But that's the Majestic Princess, and it's docked on Pier 1, and so the buoys provide a sort of sculptural decoration for the pier, and of course you see the buoys all over the depot area. But that's the Majestic Princess, and the land that is just across that water is where I live in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And that's Kate Walker. Now, Kate Walker came originally from Germany, and to make a long and I think interesting story short, she was not terribly enthused about being the wife of a lighthouse keeper. Her husband, who she met in Sandy Hook at Fort Hancock, where she was working, he was teaching her English. He got a job working at Sandy Hook Lighthouse, and then eventually over to Robbins Reef. She didn't want to go there at first. The poor man died of pneumonia 4 years after they arrived at Robbins Reef, and she ended up taking charge of Robbins Reef. By the way, the name Robin is Dutch for seal. So it was a reef that was known for seals playing. And I'm happy to report to you, Andrew, that seals have been spotted in and around New York Harbor again, showing that the pollution controls that began in the 1950s are definitely taking effect, and seals are back. So that's Robbins Reef. And the story of Kate Walker, they did a story of her in the 1918 New York Times. She was kind of a legend in her own time. Great woman. Right. Lots more to tell you about her.
And of course, one of the buoy tenders from the Coast Guard here in New York Harbor is named in honor of her as well.
That's right. I'm glad you mentioned that.
And soon we'll have a statue of her as well in Staten Island.
I think it's very well deserved. You know, she was a great lady. She was courageous. She was a great mother. She had a lot of interesting. She was a great sewer, a great knitter. She loved German opera, and she kept everything impeccably. At first, I think some of the inspectors thought she couldn't do the job, and then when they saw how amazingly she kept everything, they gave her the full keeper position, which I think gave her something like $600 a year. Right. But of course, $600 back then was a lot more than it is today. All right, this is a collection of patches, and Bob Isley, who is one of our great volunteers, a wonderful man, he started a collection he found out about the fact that if the police department or fire department if there's a lighthouse in the town where they're operating, they put a lighthouse on their patch. So when he found that out, he was in Ponce de Leon, which is a beautiful lighthouse in Florida. And so he got a Ponce de Leon patch, and 2,000 patches later, wow. Bob, whose nickname is Patches, managed to collect almost every lighthouse patch in the Western Hemisphere, and some in Europe, and I think 1 or 2 in Asia. So we have about 2,000 patches showing lighthouses as the symbol that are either fire department or police department official patches.
And I can see Detroit, Michigan, right over
there. Perfect. I'm glad you could. You had that good Michigan eye.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. So we're just about out of time. If anyone has any last questions, please drop them in the chat. But Wade, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your incredible knowledge. This was such a wonderful presentation. We've just put up on the screen here some of the ways that you can stay in touch and follow the Lighthouse Museum on social media, check out their website, and of course, support them. You know, museums are really struggling right now, like so many institutions. You know, this is a great time. If you've been putting off supporting your favorite local museum, now's the time to do it and make it the National Lighthouse Museum.
Yeah. If I could say one word, and I know we're just about out of time,
yeah,
Andrew, but I'd like to emphasize to everyone that it was really the lighthouses were America's first infrastructure. And Alexander Hamilton, who was, of course, Treasury Secretary, and George Washington really micromanaged the lighthouse establishment. They played an incredibly detailed role because they knew how important it was for us to get trade. The only way we were going to collect taxes was through customs duties, and these customs duties could not be collected if the goods hit a shoal. And so lighthouses are very much inextricably linked with the survival of the American Republic. And after 5 years of the management of Alexander Hamilton, who's really, we could say, the father of the Coast Guard, the father of the lighthouse establishment, one of the fathers of the United States, certainly, without the lighthouse establishment, this country would not have survived. And so I take a particularly strong patriotic view of lighthouses. In addition to their beauty, the wonderful materials that they encompass, and just the wonderful aspects of these structures. But keep in mind that they account for America's economy in the early phase of the Republic.
And of course, we talked about this on a previous program, but Alexander Hamilton was, of course, involved in the creation of Sailor Snug Harbor. So he's basically an honorary Staten Islander. So
that's right. He did the legal work for Jonathan Randall, who donated, and free of charge, by the way. And Hamilton, there's nothing that Hamilton didn't touch. His omnipresence in the early history of the United States is really one of the great stories of America. And so any support that anyone can provide for the National Lighthouse Museum is greatly appreciated, especially during this very difficult year that we've been experiencing.
And I just had one more question, which is, you mentioned you're doing boat tours. When can people sign up for one of those?
Yes, there are boat tours now. I believe there's one coming up on September 15th. If you type into the National Lighthouse Museum, you'll see their new flyer for the 3 tours that we're going to be doing. We're going to do one of the Hudson River, not the full Hudson River tour, because we have a few handicaps where we can't be on the boat as long, and all of the sort of difficulties that are involved at this particular phase. But there's one of the Hudson. There's one that's going to be a sort of Staten Island, south coast of Staten Island tour that will take you to the Ambrose Channel, Coney Island Light. And then we're going to do a haunted Halloween tour very close to Halloween. And that one, which I came up with the title a couple of years ago, Murder, Mayhem, and Ghosts on the East River. But somehow that got changed. But the theme of the tour, there's been a lot of terrible things that have happened on the East River, unbelievable murder and mayhem, and so that's one of the themes of that Halloween tour. But it's going to be, I'm afraid, a bit modified. It won't go all the way to Sandy Hook as it once did, but it'll go up to Roosevelt Island, and it should be fun. And everybody has a costume. Everybody's sort of required to have a costume, and it's a great deal of fun, that Halloween tour.
Well, wonderful. Well, Wade, thank you so much, and I want to give a special thanks as well to Linda at the Lighthouse Museum, and to my colleague Stefan. Stefan was the one who helped pull this whole program together, but unfortunately, he lives in a 360 old building, and they've had trouble getting the internet back up and running after about a
Oh
week.
my goodness.
So he wasn't able to join us today, but he
Stefan,
sends his best to you.
Stefan did a great job, and Linda's a wonderful executive director, and she's working real hard. And we all admire all the energy that she's put in. And I should mention that Princess Anne has agreed to be our patron. You know, she's the she has the preeminent position at Trinity House, the British equivalent of what was the Lighthouse establishment.
Oh wow!
And so we've been fortunate enough to secure support from Princess Anne, and she may be visiting our museum next spring.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
That's wonderful.
so we're very excited. Yeah. If you take a look at our recent newsletter, the summer 2020 newsletter, it's all discussed in that newsletter. And always look for the tours and the dates and everything in that site.
Yeah, and just a last thing to mention here. So where you sign up for tickets on our website, you can come back to that page and you can find all the links that we talked about. So if you want to find upcoming events and those tours and the National Lighthouse Museum's website, you can find that all there. Join us for our next program, which is going to be on Wednesday. We're going to be discussing the USS Arizona and the USS Missouri, and visit us at turnstiletours.com to find all of our upcoming programs. But Wade, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for the great questions, and
of course,
and for all your knowledge too.
Thank you.